I've been writing about the history of universities for a while, and I was curious about why so many students who got recruited to the CIA during the 1950s and 60s were recruited from departments of literature and history. It turns out that literally all of their professors, I'm only slightly exaggerating, were spies during World War II, so they still had connections with the agency. So that's where the serious research for this began. So women were 34, about 34% of the OSS. And they did, they did code breaking, they did computing. Computer used to be a job title, but they also went out in the field. And look, everybody loves a female spy, Although, as you say, the James Bond stories tend to give them a certain role, whereas they played a much bigger role in the real historical stage. There was one guy who was part of the group of people at the end of World War II who they went into Germany and the occupied countries and they captured the scientists who had been working on the German atom bomb. That was their job. And I think it was Samuel Gutschmidt. He was with this group and he was a nuclear physicist himself. So he could sort of figure out who knew what. They were trying to keep the Germans from basically setting off an atom bomb. The war wasn't quite finished yet. And every town and city he went to, he was looking for a femme fatale. He said in his memoir, like, I haven't found a femme fatale yet. He was very upset because he really wanted kind of someone with like a Veronica Lake hairstyle, and she would, try to seduce him out of his secrets, but he never found one. And he was very sad about that. Adele Kyber, she was delightful. First of all, she was the most productive document acquisitions agent for the Allies, and it wasn't close. She was the Usain Bolt of being a bibliographic detective, of going into archives and getting all of these documents that she should not have been able to get access to, and then sending them back to the Allies. And some of them wound up, for instance, in the library of a little place in Los Alamos, a little library in Los Alamos where the Americans were working on a bomb of their own. Adele Kyber got her PhD in classics at the University of Chicago. And because women couldn't really go into the professoriate in those years, she got a job as a freelance archive hunter. She went from archive to archive across Europe, and she took photographs of hard to get texts. And professors back home in the States would pay her to do this. You can still pay people to do this, and they make pretty good money. Someone I hired to take photographs of documents in the National Archives for me, Sim Smiley, who has a great name for this sort of work. I believe that the fee was $70 an hour, which isn't too shabby. This is what you pay for expertise. But anyway, so she was so good at this that she got hired by a guy who sort of was trying to build an entire organization dedicated to making research available to people back home in the States. And he got recruited into the OSS at the beginning of World War II, Eugene Power. And so he recruited Kyber, and she got sent to, after her training, to Stockholm, which was a neutral country, but it wasn't an impartial country. The Swedish police had trained with the Gestapo, and also Sweden was allowed to stay out of the war on the condition that no spies operated in Sweden. The warring countries wanted Sweden free from spies. So you can imagine that somebody like Adele Kyber, who was there as a spy, had to work totally undercover. Sherman Kent was fantastic. He was a history professor at Yale. He was a very good professor, a brilliant guy, but he really should have been a drill sergeant. He While he was lecturing, he liked to throw chalk past the heads of his students, which they don't let us do anymore. And after he got recruited into the OSS, he learned at the training camp to throw daggers with such accuracy that for the rest of his career, they said he could throw a knife better than a Sicilian. He also learned other spy tricks like how to take a newspaper and fold it into a deadly weapon. Because most of the time during World War II, spies couldn't carry weapons. They had to learn how to make weapons out of the materials around them. Kent winds up going into he becomes the leader of analysts basically. He is telling people who are working in the basement of the Library of Congress or in these plywood buildings all over Washington, who are reading all of the documents that Kyber is sending home, reading through literal tons of documents and trying to find clues that could be of strategic or tactical value in the war. You know, some mention in the society column of a French newspaper that can tell you where a garrison is, or reading for minute fluctuations in railroad rates that can tell you where ball bearings are being sent. You know what I mean? Just reading in this extraordinary and adventurous way to find clues that are in public documents, but nobody ever thought would get out because these are documents that nobody ever reads. He was in charge of those guys, and he rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. And the thing that made him really good at his job is the fact that he was, how do I say this? He was a wonderfully belligerent, wonderfully profane person. He could talk to generals in their own language, and he was the one who convinced the military to follow through with the suggestions and analyses that these tweedy professors provided. For humanities professors to be giving you advice on how to carry out a war, this is something new in the history of spycraft. This is something new in the history of warfare. There was already a section of the OSS, research and development, that had scientists working in it. They were building bombs, they were trying to make shoes that turned into radio transmitters, that sort of thing. That's a well-known type of institution at other spy agencies. But for humanists to be doing this kind of work, for your literature professor to be trying to defeat Hitler, this was something new, and the military wouldn't have listened to what those Tweedy professors had to say if Sherman Kent hadn't been their representative. So he was the right man in the right time in the right place. Joseph Curtis. So he was very much a hothouse flower. He was born and died in the same house, which you can only do if you're very poor or very wealthy. He was very wealthy. He went to undergrad at Yale, then grad school at Yale, then became a professor at Yale, which is something Yale does. He had a very safe, very cozy little life of letters, a professor of Renaissance literature, living in a residential college as, sort of the in-house professor. And then he got pulled out of that life, trained as a spy, and thrown into wartime Istanbul, where his job was to track down German spies and turn them into double agents. This is a life as far from the life that, that the world expected of him, that he expected of himself as possible. But the marvelous thing is, he did a really good job. Istanbul and Sweden had opposite policies as far as spycraft was concerned. Sweden asked the warring countries how it could stay neutral, and the answer was that it could stay neutral if nobody's spies operated in Sweden. Turkey asked the warring countries how Turkey could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Turkey could stay out of the war if everybody's spies operated in Turkey. So Turkey was full of spies. 17 different spy agencies operated in Istanbul. The agents often sat rival agents sat at adjoining restaurant tables trying to eavesdrop on each other's conversation while the waiter eavesdropped on them both. This was a world where everyone was presumed to be a spy. And you know what? Nobody ever suspected Joseph Curtis. I think he was the only person in Istanbul who got out, and nobody ever thought he had been a spy. Wild Bill Donovan had been a Wall Street lawyer. He was tapped by the president to become the leader of this new organization called the OSS. This is just before war breaks out, before the United States enters the war, after the war has already started. And Donovan was a lawyer, and that was significant to what he decided to do, which is he decided that it was important to do the reading. To make sure that before strategic analysis was presented to the military and to the president and such, somebody needed to read all of the documents that bore on their decision. It's a lawyerly sort of thing to do. But basically, it was Donovan's decision to go through the universities and the libraries of the nation to send people out. Somebody would show up at your classroom door while you were teaching, or you'd get a phone call while you were working in the library, or somebody would come to your office during a school football game when nobody would notice another alumni-looking dude walking around campus in a suit. And they'd come in and they'd tell you things about yourself that even your closest friends didn't know. And then they'd say, how would you like to serve your country in a different way? I wasn't able to profile everyone that I wanted to, but eventually I ran out of pages and they wouldn't let me add stuff anymore. There was there was a guy who, Henry Dole Smythe, who was called to a meeting in Washington in early 1945, told that an atom bomb existed, which was a closely guarded secret, that an atom bomb was in development. He was a professor at Princeton. He understood how an atom bomb would work. And his job was to write a book that would be published right after the atom bomb dropped that would explain how an atom bomb worked, because everyone would be asking that. But this was an intelligence operation, and it was actually the last and most successful disinformation campaign of the war, because he wrote correctly how an atom bomb worked, but he only wrote about the physics. So if you've seen Oppenheimer, or if you've seen actually basically any movie or television show or anything like that about making the bomb, it's always about these kind of wild-haired physicists saying, well, what if we split the atom? He left out the chemistry, he left out the metallurgy, he left out the engineering. That is, he left out the important part of how to make an atom bomb. The physics of how to build an atomic bomb was the easiest part to figure out from first principles, and also, in some respects, the least important part, because if you want to turn a split atom into a bomb, you need to figure out how to keep the fission going while the bomb is exploding, and that belongs to those other disciplines. So, he put in correct information, but only a very slender thread of correct information. And it worked. To this day, when we tell the story of the atom bomb, we are just talking about the physicists. It was a misinformation campaign so successful that it permanently changed how we thought about this, the decisive stroke in the war. So I managed to get in a little bit about him. Part of my position on the war was that this was a war that a lot of ordinary people who were content with being ordinary people had to fight. It wasn't like the Mission Impossible movies where there's like one guy who's like super handsome and can punch his way through walls, and knows and can infiltrate a gala. It's a lot of different people who are ordinary people with a lot of courage. That's what it takes to win a war of this kind. It's a little bit scattershot in the sense that I tried to bring in a lot of those ordinary people's stories while still following the stories of a core group of people who knew each other. I don't know how successful I was, but that was my thinking.